Hi, everybody. It's Jay, and I am back in the booth with you for another sneak peek video preview for this week's new release here on Say with Jay. Our new release this week is Just a Cowboy's Shotgun Wedding. It's the 7th book in Jessie Gussman's Flyboys of Sweet Briar Ranch Western Sweet Romance series. And I'll say more about the story and have a live preview for you in just a bit. But first, as many of you know, Jessie has been including recipes and dishes in the stories in this series, and I've been making them for you here. Well, today is no different, so it is time for another segment of Cooking with Jay. Now, I'm very excited about today's recipe because it is my chance to share with you a treasured family recipe that, technically, it's not a family recipe because I downloaded it off the internet. And it's not really treasured because the recipe's not all that rare or special. And now the food is, although it's not so much treasured as it is inhaled in my house. So anyway, I digress. What I'm talking about is my family's favorite snack of all time. It is ultimately customizable to whatever you're in the mood for, but me and mine prefer it nice and spicy. I am talking about Chex Mix. Yes, and you can get a nice base recipe at chex.com. Now, I should say that I'm not in any way sponsored by Chex or any of the products that I'm using in this recipe, although I darn well should be, I think. As I said, if you're not in the mood for hot and spicy, you can change the flavor to really whatever you like. But here is how me and mine make our hot and spicy Chex Mix. Before you get started, you're going to want to preheat your oven to 250 degrees and then get 2 large baking pans and spray them lightly with nonstick cooking spray. All right, so here are the ingredients that I use to make my hot and spicy Chex Mix. And as always, don't worry about trying to capture these ingredients or the amounts. I'll have them listed in the description of the video down below. One quick note about quantities here. They're more or less guidelines for me, and I'll list the quantities that I have on my recipe, but as you'll see, I don't really follow them too closely. You'll see what I mean in just a bit. Okay, to start with, obviously you're going to need Chex Mix. My recipe calls for 4 cups each of Rice Chex, Corn Chex, and Wheat Chex. I use about 2 cups of pretzel sticks, and to round out the dry ingredients, about 2 cups of Goldfish. For our coating, we're going to need a stick and a half of butter, 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce, 1.5 teaspoons of seasoned salt, 3 tablespoons of buffalo wing sauce, which adds kind of a mild heat but a good bit of flavor, and then 1 tablespoon of hotter pepper sauce. You can use Tabasco if you like. If I'm using Tabasco, I usually add 8 to 12 dashes. Now, next, you're going to need a comically large mixing bowl. Fun fact, when I bought this, clearly I had no idea how big a 20-quart stainless steel bowl would be. I mean, I'm sure I learned in elementary school like everybody else that there are 4 quarts to a gallon, and that should have been a clue, but, well, here we are. Okay, first, you add all of your dry ingredients to a bowl. Once you have all of your dry ingredients in your bowl, give it a rough mix. Don't worry, I have washed my hands. And I actually do prefer to do it by hand rather than using utensils to avoid crushing and crumbling the pieces. Once that's roughly mixed, set it aside. Next, you want to melt your butter And to that melted butter, you want to add your seasoned salt. And one quick note here, the seasoned salt is probably the only thing that I'm reasonably careful of measuring, at least to start with. You're going to find this coating mix is sort of an iterative process. You'll add things to taste, but you don't want to make it overly salty. You can always add more, but you can't take it out. Next, you're going to add your Worcestershire sauce and your buffalo wing sauce. Next is your hotter sauce. And as you can tell, these I don't worry about getting exact, because you're going to mix it up and then taste it. Then feel free to adjust, add a little bit more of this or that to taste. Once you've got the coating mix to your satisfaction, it's time to add it to our dry ingredients. I prefer to pour it in a little bit at a time and then mix. Again, I'm doing it by hand to avoid crumbling and crunching up the pieces. It is very messy this way, so feel free to use utensils if you like. Also, I did wash my hands again before I started this part. And then slowly add the mix and keep mixing until everything is evenly coated. Next, pour it into your prepared baking pans and place them in your preheated 250-degree oven. You're going to let it bake for 1 hour, and the directions say to stir well every 15 minutes, but as you've seen, since I'm making such a ludicrously large amount, what I prefer to do is every 15 minutes take the pans out of the oven, dump them back into the comically large mixing bowl, and then pour them back into the pans. This effectively mixes it for you without getting the pieces all crushed and crumbled with a spoon. As you can tell, I'm a little sensitive about that. Put them back into the oven and repeat every 15 minutes until your hour is up. Once the time is up, you want to spread your Chex Mix out on paper towels to cool. Feel free to go ahead and eat it while it's warm, but it is critically important to allow it to cool completely before you store it, which you'll want to do in airtight containers, and if it's warm at all, it'll cause condensation to form and you'll wind up with soggy Chex Mix. Yuck. Now, that's of course assuming that there is any left to store. It can be touch and go at my house sometimes. In any case, here is the finished product, Hot and Spicy Chex Mix. And that is how I make my Hot and Spicy Chex Mix. I hope you'll give it a try. If you do, please let me know how it goes in the comments down below. If you don't like spicy, but you have other variations of Chex Mix that you like, I'd love to hear about those too. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Just a Cowboy's Shotgun Wedding. Just a Cowboy's Shotgun Wedding is the story of Gideon Marsh, who we've met previously in the other books in the series. Gideon is one of the Flyboys, one of the former U.S. Air Force airmen who, along with friends, bought the Sweet Briar Ranch. Gideon has agreed to help a young widow, who we also met in a previous book, Piper Hughes. Now, Piper lives in a small farmhouse with her 6 children. It's a 2-bedroom house, again, with 6 children. Her husband had planned on expanding their house before his untimely death 2 years previously. And, of course, as you might well imagine, that expansion hasn't been done. So the town rallied behind Piper and bought the materials for her expansion, and Gideon, who, before his time in the Air Force, spent a lot of time in home construction for a company that actually specialized in doing additions. So he has agreed to put the addition on for free. Now, when he arrives at the home to help Piper, an accident occurs. Now, I don't want to spoil too much of the story, so I'll leave it at that. But the end result is that Gideon finds himself in a situation where he's called upon to do much more than put the addition on the house. So here is a spoiler-free live preview reading from Just a Cowboy Shotgun Wedding. I hope you enjoy it, and then come back this Friday for the full release here on Say with Jay.
Lucas, don't bother Mr. Gideon. He's here to work.
Piper's voice didn't hold anger or censure, but she clearly meant what she said. Lucas closed his mouth and looked down. It's okay, unless there's a reason you don't want him to talk to me. I really like kids, always have. Maybe that's because I'm just a big kid myself. At least, that's what people say. He'd been accused of that all of his life. He'd actually worked hard on trying to be a little more mature, less likely to do something stupid, but he still loved goofing off.
I just don't want him to bother you. A lot of people don't like to have kids running around while they're trying to work,
she said, with apology and concern in her voice. I promise, if there's a problem, I'll say so, but I actually like the chaos. Noise drives some people crazy, but not me. She lifted her brows, almost as though his words surprised her. But if she knew his personality at all, they really shouldn't. Maybe she didn't know. They went to the same church, but hardly ever, if ever, spoke to each other. He didn't exactly hang out wherever she did, which was probably wherever the kids of the church were. Since he'd moved to Sweetwater a few years ago, her attendance had been sporadic. He'd heard people attribute that to the fact that her husband had passed away, and she had all the kids to take care of by herself. It did seem like kids were a lot of fun, but he supposed they were a lot of work as well. Not that he would ever know, since he'd never had the responsibility of watching even one, let alone 6. There was a part of him, a part that was bigger than he maybe wanted to admit, that thought having 6 kids would make everything more fun. Not that he actually wanted to have 6 kids of his own. He didn't. Only crazy people did that. He stopped that thought before it went any further. He didn't want to insult Piper, but that did seem to be the general consensus of the world today, that 1 or 2 kids were okay, 3 was pushing it, and any more was irresponsible. He wasn't sure he agreed with that, but it wasn't like he had to think about it over much either. Piper had nodded her head, then turned around to continue walking, leading him toward the area where he'd be working. Maybe if she hadn't been turned around, maybe if he hadn't distracted her, or if there weren't so many kids yelling and making noise, or maybe if she hadn't been holding the baby on one hip, Gideon wasn't sure, but he thought that she would have seen the toy tractor lying on the floor and would have been able to avoid stepping on it. As it was, it seemed to happen in slow motion before him. Slow motion, but too fast for him to run ahead and grab her, as her foot went out from underneath her, twisting on the way down, as she started to fall, but throwing herself to the side so she wasn't falling on the baby she had on her hip. He noticed that and was impressed by it, even as he ran toward her, getting there just as she hit the ground. If this were a romance novel, I would have caught you. He wasn't sure why those words came out of his mouth. He should utter some kind words of compassion or ask if she was okay. But it probably had to do with the reason everyone told him he was immature. He never had the right words to say and ended up saying something that totally didn't fit the situation. Immediately he said, "I'm sorry, are you okay?" He spoke in a loud tone beside her, through the cries of her children and the crying of the baby, who had landed on her hip and was fine, just surprised. Gideon's hand landed on her shoulder. She didn't answer right away, and as Gideon looked closer, her face was pulled up in a grimace. He figured that maybe the twist he saw her do had put more pressure on her ankle than he had first thought. He waited, knowing from experience that when he first got hurt, the sharp pain needed to fade before he could talk to anyone. Unsure if the child would let him pick her up, he reached out to get her off her hip. For him, when he was dealing with the initial acute throbbing, he was a lot more sensitive to anything that touched him. He couldn't imagine having a child jumping on him. "Hey there, let me hold you," he said easily and softly as he picked the kid up. She was wearing pink, but the hair was a boy cut. Or maybe the child just hadn't grown hair out. He wasn't sure. Surely the mom wouldn't dress a boy in pink? Back when he was a kid, he would have said no way. But in today's world, he supposed a person couldn't tell the gender just by looking at the colors the child wore.
"That's Theodora,"
the tallest girl said from beside his elbow. "Thanks," he said, grateful she had come over. As he'd been looking, the baby's face had started to scrunch up, but when she saw her sister, it smoothed out. Not completely, but enough that he didn't think she was going to erupt in a yell imminently.
"She doesn't let anyone but Mom hold her,"
the other girl said matter-of-factly. "Well, your mom isn't able to right now, so hopefully Theodora won't mind if I substitute for a bit." The baby wasn't going to have a choice, so he did his best to look non-threatening, whatever that looked like, as his gaze shifted back to Piper. She had been pushing herself up off the floor, but as his eyes skimmed down her legs, he could tell from the angle of her foot that whatever she'd done to it, it was going to take an emergency room visit to fix it.
Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.